Anyway, we're on page 15, unless somebody has questions, disputations, curses, or other comments to make about what we did before. Point F, the eternal law, which is God's view of how he has planned everything. Notice it depends not on the divine will, but the divine nature. Now, you have to go into the metaphysics to remember that in God, the divine will and the divine nature are identical. He's one in substance, and every aspect and attribute of his being is identical with his very substance or essence. So he is, you might say, an eternal act of the will. I'm slipping off into metaphysics here, which I very much enjoy, but it's not the topic of the course, is it?
It still works.
It's still fun. But it does help you to understand better why voluntarism would make no sense in terms of God, because he is eternally his own will to create the world as he has created it. It cannot be other than the way he wills it to be, because he is eternally his own act of will. It's a little hard to grasp. He is an eternal free act. It's really, really weird for us to think of that, because we think, well, we're here and then we have to perform acts that are free, and we do this as we go through time. But God is utterly outside of time, and in him there is no succession of moments, as it were. So he is simultaneously his own act of choice. Whatever he chooses from all eternity. It cannot be otherwise than as he chooses it, but that's Monday morning quarterbacking from our perspective. From his perspective, it is still a free act. Now, that kind of makes your mind sizzle a little bit, but it's interesting. As I say, though, it belongs back to metaphysics, but this is why God's plan of how things are to be is identical with his divine nature. Now, his plan for things, which we call the eternal law, can be revealed. And in fact, in some other parts of philosophy, we realize that divine revelation is a perfectly reasonable thing. It's not a matter of sitting there and saying, well, could God have revealed or might he not have revealed? His revelation arises from our own finitude and our own weakness and our own corruption, which left unto ourselves would leave us in abysmal ignorance and error and immorality. So we really need his revelation, and he can, of course, reveal the natural law to us through that revelation, and actually, as we will see, does so in the Ten Commandments. But when we talk about natural law, we're not talking about revelation, but we're rather looking at the very way in which God has created us. Because the way we are created is our nature. So what we're looking at, as it says, nature are the intrinsic, we're looking at the intrinsic principles that are rooted in nature. In other words, the way that a thing is made to be by God. The way it is made to be as to its very substance. And for physical things, of course, this is something that must be as it is. Physical nature has no free choice. It doesn't really get exciting till we come to man, where we do have free choice. And therefore, that's where you get the moral law, at least among bodily creatures. I'm prescinding from the angels here. You have moral law in the case of man, which is not a must. You know, Adam doesn't get up in the morning and decide whether to brush its teeth or which way to get out of bed. From a standpoint of an atom, it's a necessity what it does. Under given certain conditions, it's going to act a certain way. And there really is no such thing as chance, meaning pure spontaneity, at the subatomic level, but that's metaphysics again, sorry. As far as human beings are concerned, we're talking about how we ought to freely operate. Now, there is a must entailed there because our nature determines what we must do if we are to act in a way that is perfective of our being. But because we have free will, this comes through in the form of an ought, what we ought to do. So even in the case of human beings, though, part of what we do is by nature, and part of what we do is by choice. Like it says in your notes, by nature, we marry. And of course, that simply means that it's appropriate to us to marry. It doesn't mean that we absolutely have to marry. But if we do follow the call of nature in marrying, then it's a matter of choice, free choice, as to whom we marry. We're not bound by that, but of course we're not bound absolutely even to marry, are we? I guess what this means is we are the marrying kind of species. We are a species which maintains its existence as a species by procreation within the confines of marriage. I know that's a little hard to tell people that today, but that is nonetheless the divine plan. So, what is natural law? Remember, from God's perspective, it's called eternal law. From our perspective, it's called natural law. It is the practical, there's a lot in this paragraph, the practical universal judgments, practical because they pertain to things to be done, universal because they are applicable in a general way. They always apply. In other words, you don't get to murder one day and not another. There's something universal about it. They are obligatory. We may have a choice as to whether to obey them, but we are bound, we are obliged, we are under a mandate of our nature and of natural law and ultimately of God to act according to these universal practical judgments. They are judgments of reason. Remember, it's reason that enables us to read the natural law. That's the instrument by which we read it. They are rules of human conduct discovered by the use of right reason and derived from man's nature adequately considered. Adequately meaning fully considered. These universal judgments are established by the author of human nature, namely God, as essential to the divine purpose and promulgated by reason. We all have reason built into us, and therefore we are expected by God to use it in order to live rationally, and to live rationally means to reflect upon our nature, understand it essentially, if not 100% fully, and act in accordance with acts which are conformable to that nature and to its perfection. Now, H is a very important point. Natural moral law is not just an idle set of rules. I think sometimes people think, well, there's God up in his heaven and he lays down these rules and we have to obey them. And it just seems so arbitrary. Of course, that would be a positivistic way of looking at it. And it's not a positivistic thing at all. What God is doing is establishing for us that which we really are and which acts are perfective of our being. That's why it says it is constitutive. It tells us how we ought to be. It is a blueprint that describes good behavior. Now, what we have to kind of focus on, kind of an insight that I would draw our attention to, is that we're talking about the way in which we are as human beings. Don't think of the natural law as being a bunch of rules like the Ten Commandments that are somehow imposed from above, and which could have been otherwise, or are like a set of rules you just have to obey or you get into a lot of trouble, as though they were external rules that somebody made up. think of it rather that this is simply a revelation, either through revelation or by reason, of an understanding of what it is we are as human beings. In other words, what actions ought I perform in order to be fully a human being? There's kind of a schizophrenic way of looking at it, I think, that sometimes people think, well, here are these external laws that God has imposed, and here I could be perfectly happy if, he just dropped a few of them. Like the old joke I saw somewhere about them printing the Ten Commandments, and somebody left out one. And they thought, this is fantastic. Or you probably heard about the mistake that was made. Was it the second edition of the King James Version of the Bible? Yeah, they got the seventh commandment. They left the not out. So it reads, "Thou shalt commit adultery." That was really a hot seller.
Not waiting for the publisher.
Well, the truth is, the king at the time, and it may have been Henry VIII, I'm not sure. Who would it have been? Whoever.
Maybe King James?
There's a thought. Yeah, maybe it was King James the First. At any rate, the publisher, the editor, actually wound up in jail, I understand, for having made that mistake. So, we don't do that to publishers today. Maybe they suspected it was an intentional error, or talk about an ultimate Freudian slip.
Yeah. It was a good commandment.
But at any rate, to get back to where I was trying to go with all this, don't think of this as something external to us that God is somehow imposing on us. This is a matter of how we are made to be, so that even what we think to be the most private of sins, moral errors, really is destructive of our being, even if we think it isn't, even if we think, there shouldn't be a rule for this. If we understood fully how we are constituted as human beings, we would be able to understand the disorder that it puts within our being to deviate from natural law, either in thought or deed. There is an intrinsic relationship between us and the totality of our own nature and us and the rest of society, such that any deviation from the natural law is actually hurting ourselves and hurting our relationship to others. It's not, in other words, something that is purely arbitrarily imposed from above. What God is doing in telling us, giving us something like the Ten Commandments, is He's telling us this is how we really are, and if we want to be and to be happy and perfect as human beings, these are the rules we have to follow. And indeed, how often we find out in society, as we see today, those who readily abandon something as staid and true as the Ten Commandments do wind up in a heap of trouble, don't they? It's well to say, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," and people say, well, what harm can it do, Just ask a politician that gets outed. These come home to roost in many a different way. And it's not a purely private matter ultimately after all. And we see in our society the complete disintegration that has taken place with the family because of an ignoring of the basic commandments such as the Sixth and Ninth Commandments and the horrendous woe and penalties and costs that it makes to society. So it's very easy for the secularist, for the skeptic to say, we don't need to follow any of these rules because there is no God to impose them on us. No, we have to understand that the intrinsic principles of virtue are essential to our own happiness, not only in the world to come, not only after this life, but even within this life. And then even if we think we're somehow getting away with something there is a disorder within our own intrinsic psychology that results from certain kinds of vicious or sinful actions that we think are purely private and have no effect on us whatever. This is a very big misunderstanding. So I'd like us to think of natural law primarily as something coming from within our being and not something that is somehow being imposed by God from outside. The natural law is preceptive, of course. It is also a command. It tells us what we ought to do, which is obligatory, and it tells us that we must do it. So, of course, yes, there is the command part of it, which is the external part that says we have to do it, we ought to do it. If we don't, we will face certain sanctions in this world and especially in the world to come. But that is what I refer to as kind of being the external norm. Internally, we should realize that by not acting virtuously, we do corrupt our very being. So it's not without principle that we refer to certain actions as being corruptive. We talk about somebody as having a degenerate nature because of actions that they have committed. And of course, here we see at the bottom of the page the reference to the Ten Commandments. And of course we say, well, that's revelation, but when you think about the Ten Commandments very carefully and go through each one of them, you will see that each one of them reflects something that is inherent in natural law. The first three, or is it four, refer to our relations with God. And certainly that is primary. That we have within our nature an obligation, once we know that God exists, to honor him, to adore him, to respect him, to even engage in public worship. You know, many people say, well, I'm not obligated to go to church on Sunday or attend Mass or synagogue or what have you, because I'm leading a good life privately. But we forget that God created not us merely as individuals, but also as members of a society. So we owe God respect and honor privately, individually, but we also owe this to him communally, as a community acting together and publicly. At any rate, if you look at the nature of the Ten Commandments, we have a distinction here between the internal act and the external act. The external act, of course, everybody understands, like the Sixth Commandment in the Catholic counting says, do not act in a certain way, do not commit adultery, do not, as the Seventh Commandment says, steal. But interestingly enough, the Ninth and 10th Commandments pick up something that we otherwise might not notice, namely the internal act, which measures the morality of the act. It specifies the act which is going to be committed. So it says, do not even covet thy neighbor's wife. Do not covet thy neighbor's property. Don't even have the intention within the will. And of course, as Christ himself says, you know, he who even looks at a woman with lust in his heart has already committed adultery with her. Clearly, there's a difference between the intention and the act, and it is far more grave to commit the act than it is to merely have the intention. But the intention marks the inclination of the will, and the inclination of the will marks the soul, in a very real sense. So, you know, if I'm going around all the time thinking about how I would love to steal your money, in a very real sense, I've got the mentality of a thief. And that, of course, is what Christ was trying to say with respect to adultery. The person who is lusting after others already has the mentality of the fornicator or adulterer. And in a very real sense, the sin is primarily in the act of the will. It is in the intentionality of the will. If somebody says, you know, I would intend to do something, but I can't, the intention is sufficient to specify what the person would be up to. I've often thought, you know, people say, well, look at this poor rabble that we find in jails all over the place who commit all kinds of horrible crimes. What nasty people they must be. And I've often thought, would you care to compare their chances of ultimate happiness against some of the lawyers that may have put them there? Of course, we immediately give some reflection there and realize what the problem is. You see, the lawyer may never commit an act that would get him behind bars because he knows too much about the law. Does that make him a more virtuous person? He may indeed be willing and perhaps able, but certainly willing and wanting to commit all of these illegal acts, and perhaps his responsibility for having such corrupt intentions really is far more grave than that of the common criminal who largely stumbles into the crimes he commits and perhaps isn't trying to do it all the time, or perhaps is even trying to avoid it but isn't too good at avoiding it. In other words, that's why you can't tell a person's real morality by how they behave, because you don't know what's going on inside their mind. You don't know what's in their intentionality and what they would do if they thought they could get away with it. But God, who knows all things and knows our hearts and knows our souls and our minds, reminds us that we are bound primarily by the internal act. And in fact, the specification of the act, the morality, the immorality or morality of an act is primarily in the act of the will. The actual execution of the act by the body secondarily is secondary. In other words, if I were to tell my body to take up a knife and stab you to death, and for some reason my arm was paralyzed, am I a better person? Well, I suppose it's better than actually having killed you, but as far as the intentionality is concerned, I'm a murderer. I would murder you if I could. So the commanded act may indeed fail. The primary focus of the morality is in the intentional act, which is internal and which specifies. In other words, it puts the act into its species. So if I'm thinking of robbing you and intending to rob you, even if I don't actually do it, I've already committed the act in its species. I've intended to do that which is immoral, even though ultimately, for some reason, I wind up not doing it. Page 16. The external act, of course, is a greater violation because it has greater consequences. It's sort of the icing on the cake. So I not only intend to rob you, but I actually do it. And of course, that entails something which society has to act upon. Traditionally, society does not adjudge the internal act. This is a fallacy behind the hate crimes legislation. Hate crimes legislation makes no sense because you're trying to judge something you can't judge. If I beat you to death, does it really matter whether I did it because I didn't like your color or whether I did it because I just didn't like you? You're still dead. I still beat you to death and I still wanted to do it. And that's what law needs to enforce. Now, law does have to adjudicate intentionality in this respect. You have to determine whether somebody, for example, intended to do an act. That's why we distinguish between premeditated murder and manslaughter and negligent homicide, because we're looking at the aspects of the intentionality in that order because we have to. But as far as the commission of crimes themselves, as to the reason why you did it, first of all, there's really no way readily to be sure of what a person's reason was. And number two, whatever the reason was, of course we have reasons for doing bad things. It doesn't matter what the reason is. What matters is we consented to the temptation. We consented to doing the act. That's what measures the morality of the act. And as far as society is concerned, of course, it's an extremely dangerous thing to enact legislation based upon subjective knowledge or subjective intention of people, which you really can't readily adjudicate. And it ultimately doesn't add much to the malice. As I say, if I beat you to death, you're still beaten to death regardless of why I did it. And properly, I deserve good and stiff punishment for having done it. Natural law is not a product of the whim of God. Again, it's not a positivistic philosophy. Rather, it's based on the nature of things. Even God cannot change the essence of things. Well, what essence? Well, he could have changed our essence before he made us. He could have made us completely different kinds of beings, I suppose. But the point is, once we exist and have the nature we have, which is a human nature, then it would be a contradiction in terms to say that God would make us to be as human beings, but he also would say, well, you don't have to act as human beings. You are what I made you to be, but I don't expect you to act according to the way I made you to be. That would be to contradict us in our very nature, and it would be for him to contradict his own nature or his own intention in creating us. So he would say, because when he creates us, that's his intention exercising a creative act, constituting our very being. So it's an expression of his intention, and for him to therefore suddenly say, well, but you don't have to be the way I made you to be, because we act according to our being. If you were going to act contrary to your being, then you're not really being the way he made you to be, which would be a contradiction in terms. So it isn't something that God can just suddenly change. As it says, then a thing would both be and not be what its essence is. The basic laws which pertain to our nature with respect to things like not committing murder or theft or adultery and defamation and so forth flow from the very nature of man and of human society. And that's not an arbitrary thing that God can just dispense with as though it doesn't matter. We have a little side point here about the notion of duty, what I believe is referred to as deontological ethics, which is based primarily upon the notion of obligation. And indeed, of course, we do have a duty. Obligation is from the Latin ob, meaning before, and legare, meaning to tie. So when you're obligated to something, you're tied, you're bound before what? Before the law. You're bound before the law. The difficulty we find in Kant is that he so emphasizes the notion of duty that he almost dispenses with the notion of reason. Now the irony, though, is you'll notice when Kant's talking about his categorical imperative, and he talks about something like stealing, and he says, well, you should so act that your action could be a maxim for everybody else. And then if you apply this to the context of stealing, what he's saying is, well, if it would be all right for you to steal, you have to will, therefore, that everybody else could steal. And then pretty soon he says, well, of course, you wouldn't will that everybody else would steal. And suddenly you'll notice him talking about the consequences of having everybody stealing, which means that he's actually getting into the reasons in nature as to why stealing is bad. So in a certain way, he's betrayed his own categorical imperative because he has to ultimately appeal to reason to justify the universality of these imperatives. But because of his emphasis on duty, we've had some people who've got the idea that duty is the only thing that matters. As long as you're acting according to duty and the sense of duty, you're not, as Kant says, he doesn't even want you to enjoy doing the right thing. Now, if you're enjoying it, that's the wrong motive. You should do it only because it's a matter of duty, which of course is a rather perverse way of looking at it. And Kant is a voluntarist, which means he's saying that God could make things that we take to be intrinsically evil to be good. What do you do with something like odium Dei, which means hatred of God? How could God make hatred of himself be a good act? See, it's intrinsically wrong. It's a self-contradictory ethic to allow that. So this is why natural law insists that there's a consistency between God and his nature and his will and the order of nature as it is created, and our obligation to follow that order of nature within our actions. There has to be a consistency here, and there has to be a rationality here. Whereas the voluntarist would say, well, God could make us any way he wants, and then he can change the rules. He can make up the rules, and then he can change them. So while adultery would be wrong, say, for 5,000 years, maybe now it's going to be okay. Or maybe it'll be all right in this one instance. Just give me one ticket, Lord. Let me have one excuse. Just once, see? And it'll be perfectly all right. No, God can't do that, because he would be warranting an act which by its nature is contrary to reason, because it's contrary to human nature and the relationship between human beings that is established by that nature. There's nothing arbitrary here. So your obligations ultimately come from nature. And this brings us over to sanctions. Now, the idea of a sanction, of course, I think you'll see that's from the Latin sanctus, isn't it? Which refers to making something holy. And something that's holy is something that is whole. So if you're going to, in a sense, make man whole, and if you're going to make natural law whole, you have to have sanctions. Now, what are sanctions? We've got two kinds of sanctions. We normally think of a sanction as, I'm going to punish you if you disobey. But it is also, the other side of it is, I'll give you a reward if you obey. And you can't have law without sanctions, as we well know. That's one of the objections. If you put a law in the books, you have to have some kind of sanction, ordinarily. But of course, sometimes people will say, but there are laws that nobody enforces, and there aren't really any sanctions attached to them. Usually they don't mean that there are no sanctions. What they mean is that the sanction is not effectively applied. For example, in some societies, it's been argued that effectively they have laws against prostitution, but nobody enforces them. Well, you see, there are sanctions. It's just the sanctions are not being applied. Moreover, one might say, but then why have such a law? Why even bother? I would argue it still makes a difference, because it is a statement by society about the nature of a certain form of behavior. It still has a value. It's far better than saying prostitution is good. See? It's far better than saying it's fine, we approve of it. So sometimes, even though you have a law in the books that is not effectively applied, oddly enough, I live in the village of Youngstown, and I just remembered one of these laws. We have a law that says that you can't put out your garbage before 5 o'clock on the night before the day that they pick it up. And somebody actually held a village meeting where they discussed the question of, should we have a fine for those who violate the law? And in a wonderful spirit of good common sense, they said, no. We'll just have the law. Which, it's really such a wonderful thing to see that people actually could be that reasonable. And of course, it's violated all the time, but everybody knows it's there. And it makes for a much more happy community. But in general, to have laws, you have to have sanctions. You can't say you cannot park here or there. It makes me think out at the shrine once, I remember seeing a sign on a bench that said, "Thou shalt not park here." Which seems so appropriate for the shrine. But Normally, when we have parking rules, if you violate them, you get some kind of a fine or some, get a ticket or something. So if we're going to have laws in the positive order of society, we have to have sanctions, and so too in natural law there are sanctions. Anyway, let's take a look at the types of sanctions you can have. You can have sanctions that are antecedent and sanctions that are consequent. In other words, it could be a sanction conceivably before an act is performed, and there could be a sanction after. How could you have a sanction before? What would be a sanction before?
A warning.
All right, I suppose that could be. I was thinking of something like if you offered somebody a reward for good behavior. You're affecting their behavior before the act. And then after the act, you pay them. You give them the reward. So they're sanction operative in both respects. Usually, though, we think of it being consequent, don't we?
Yeah.
And there is natural and positive sanctions. We'll look at these in a minute. In fact, I'm sorry, I'm going ahead of the notes here. And there are perfect and imperfect sanctions. Okay, so let's look at the examples. Antecedent sanctions would be threats or promise of reward. As you said, Joe, a threat. Yes, that's a good thing. Consequent, the act is already done, so we actually punish the person or actually give them the reward. Positive sanctions. Now, by positive, that means, remember, something made up by somebody's will. So the legislature says if you park in the wrong place, we'll fine you. That's a positive law. We could fine you $5. You keep parking there, we fine you $10. You see, and that's why sometimes you see the fines keep getting raised, because everybody pays no attention to the law, so you have to increase it. That's also the rationale behind ultimately having different levels of sanction. So that's the reasoning behind the principle that you make the punishment fit the crime. What's that based on?
An eye for an eye for an eye.
No, remember, an eye for an eye is misunderstood. The eye for an eye,
It's not to be greater than the crime.
yeah, the problem is that they were doing horrible things to people. So if you stole something, they would, they'd take out both eyes. And so an eye for an eye said, well, if you pluck out one person's one eye, you don't take out both eyes, you take out one. That was, believe it or not, an improvement in the law. That was an amelioration of the law. They were telling them, go easier. It does not mean, though, that you have to literally do as they do in some of the Arab countries, where they literally take an eye for an eye. And as we know too many real examples there to go into them. In fact, there was exactly that happened recently. You probably some of you may have seen it, where some man blinded a woman by putting acid in her eyes, and the Islamic judge ruled that she had the right to pour acid into his eyes. And the only thing that saved him was because she wasn't as rotten as he was. She wouldn't do it. But according to the law, they'd have been perfectly happy if she'd done it. But here's the point. With positive law, if you don't want people to park somewhere, one way to really make them not park there is behead them if they do it. That would work, wouldn't it? I think it would. Does that sound like a just law? See, we got a problem. Now let me give you another example. Let's say we don't want people running around killing people. So if you kill someone, we're going to give you a $5 fine. Okay? You see the problem? That's why there's got to be a due proportion between the crime and the punishment. Lesser crimes, lesser punishments. Greater crimes, greater punishments. And that's ultimately the rationale for capital punishment in the order of sanction. it's not the entire rationale, but it's in the order of sanction, it is the rationale. That what do you do with somebody where you've come to the point where they've done such egregious acts to society that they are no longer fit to be a part of society in any way, shape, or manner. You've already got crimes for which people are put away for life and they throw away the key, and here somebody does something 30 times worse than the guy that you threw away the key for. Now what do you do with them? See? So that's why the rationale is ultimately you have different levels of punishment, fines, maybe a little bit of imprisonment, maybe a lot of imprisonment, maybe a lifetime of imprisonment. What you're doing is moving up an escalator of various levels of sanction. The ultimate sanction would be total and complete and permanent removal from society without benefit of birdcage. And that would be the ultimate rationale for capital punishment in the order of sanction. Edwin?
How would this idea of proportionality apply in the case where you've got someone who murdered 30 people and someone who murdered 30,000?
Right.
It would be unjust that the guy who got murdered 30 would get the same punishment as the guy who...
Well, in the practical order, you can, once you've crossed the line to capital punishment, there isn't much more you can do just because the criminal comes up with even greater acts against society. I suppose you could torture him first.
Yeah.
I mean, give him 30 years in jail, and at the end of it, you execute him. Give him something to look forward to.
Sometimes you hear that, the 4 life sentences, for example.
Well, that's just a way of making sure he doesn't get paroled.
Oh. But
So,
there is like,
I mean, remember too that we are, as a human society, there are limits as to how we can apply any sanction. We do the best we can. It is never perfect. Do we make mistakes? You bet we do. You bet we do. And that of course, is the ultimate argument that people use against capital punishment. They say, well, you're going to execute somebody who is innocent. And the answer is yes, probably.
It seems to me that I wonder why we would be so bent on applying proportionality in a linear fashion when we know that after we get to a certain point, it ceases to actually be effectual.
Well, it's not a question of whether it's effectual, it's a question of whether it is an expression of retributive justice, as to whether it reestablishes the respect and the content of law and justice within society. So when you say effective, you're talking about deterrence, which is an added aspect. The notion of retributive justice is the essence of all sanction in the form of punishment. And that's why we have lesser penalties for lesser crimes. But the objection that if you were to execute an innocent person, that's irreversible. Yes, it's irreversible. Might we do so? Well, I would say this is one reason that you should never apply capital punishment unless there is absolute certitude of the guilt. This should not be applied to marginal cases. But here's something people often forget. Okay, don't execute them. We'll just give him life without parole. Well, good Lord, if the man's innocent, giving him life without parole is horrendous, utterly horrendous. Think about it. You've avoided executing him, but you've done something almost as bad, if not worse. The difficulty is you can't have a system of laws without simultaneously running the risk of injustice. The alternative to running the risk of injustice is to have no system of laws, and that's the most unjust thing of all, because then you have chaos and anarchy, and nobody's rights are protected. So you got to come back. It's a kind of a reductio ad absurdum. If you're going to have law, you got to have sanctions. If you're going to have sanctions, they need to. Reason requires that they be proportionate, and if they are to be proportionate, you are going to have grave penalties for grave crimes. Which penalties are appropriate, we apply them the best we can according to right reason. But the argument that sometimes you're going to punish the innocent is not a valid argument, because the alternative is you have no system of justice. For those who are punished and who are innocent, you got to look at it in the long view and realize, well, from the standpoint of their eternal destiny, this does not condemn them to hell. In fact, they have an advantage over most of us. They know when they're going to die, and they will have a chance to get prepared for it. Now, that's a horrendous thought, but ultimately it is no different than somebody contracting a terminal illness. We get sentenced to death all the time, usually before we're 100. It happens. Doctor, did you have a...
I was I summarize this, which I'd say level of sanctions depends upon the value of society. And the values of society depend upon whether the natural law of that society, or the natural law, is followed or isn't followed. The case where the natural law isn't followed would be your Hitlers, your, what are some other great guys?
Yeah. Well, of course, that's why St. Thomas says that a law that is contrary to the natural law is not a law at all. It has no binding force. You do, of course, get into the question of, well, what does society do about it when you have a Hitler who is running the show?
Well, I mean, to my mind, the level of sanction, how you determine the level, it depends upon practically the values in that society.
And the values, as you say, the values in society should reflect natural law, which means reason applied to human nature, properly understood. So that's why a law, the application of a law, must be reasonable. It must make sense. If you can raise an objection that it doesn't make sense, that it's unreasonable, then it ought not be enacted. But remember, of course, that civil law, criminal law, is a product of human art. It's a product of legislators who are not always themselves paragons of virtue. So we live in this world. We don't create it, but we live in it, and we do the best that we can. Societies do the best they can. It's just like, in principle, there's no better form of government than a kingship. A benevolent dictator is the best, most efficient form of government, especially when he pays attention to wise and just and virtuous advisors. What more could you ask? And he listens to the people, but he still has absolute authority. So why do we have democracy? Why do we have republics? Why do we have parliaments and congresses? Real simple. We don't trust anybody to be a benevolent dictator. We're too cognizant of man's fallen condition. And therefore we go back to the next best thing, namely we say, okay, you have certain powers for a certain length of time, and the public will decide whether you stay there. It's not quite as efficient in a certain way, but we trust it more. Natural sanctions, these are interesting. How can you have, we talk about natural sanctions, now this is of course referring to something like sexual promiscuity or adultery or fornication. Some of the natural sanctions are things like AIDS or STDs. Notice it says in some cases. Clearly, if you will to violate the norms of sexual behavior, which is properly restricted to marriage between one man and one woman, you are asking to run into some of these things occurring. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody that gets AIDS or has an STD is being punished by God. It doesn't mean that they've done something wrong. But it is true that if you live in wanton violation of the norms of sexual behavior dictated by natural law, you should expect some of these sanctions as the natural side effect of such behavior. neglect of the family, loss of the spouse. Your spouse may decide no longer to stay with you if you behave this way. Those are natural sanctions. They flow from the very nature of the acts performed. In business, you get a bad reputation. You know why they always say the customer's always right even when he's wrong? You ever notice how much money people spend for advertisement, to advertise their product? And what happens if you do something dishonest to one patron, and he goes out and he tells everybody in the community, he ruins your reputation. That's a natural effect of not having conducted your business honestly. And that's why many times if there's a dispute between a customer and the business owner will let the customer have his way, even if he's losing money on it, because that's better than to have the person go out there and badmouth him forever. It doesn't mean that he has to do that, but this is why, if you're in business, you want to keep your reputation spotless. Honesty pays. That's, again, a matter of sanction. Dishonesty catches up with you, usually. Not right away. Maybe. We see all the time, though, the terrible effects that occur, where whole empires, business empires, collapse because of people doing things that were wrong. But even small businessmen can have the same thing happen. You get a reputation for just not conducting your business perfectly honestly, nobody's going to do business with you. They just won't. Perfect and imperfect. Interesting. Perfect sanction is heaven and hell. Perfect sanction is you either attain your last destiny because you have lived according to natural law in this life and met the requirements of your nature as dictated by God Almighty, or hell, you permanently, ultimately miss that last end, which is the essence of hell. Forget the hellfire and brimstone. Focus for a moment on what it means to have been created. Your entire being as a human being is ordered towards the fulfillment of attaining God as your last end, to know Him and to love Him for all eternity, and you just missed it forever. Think about what that is. To know that the very reason for your creation has been missed forever. That's hell. I flinch from the pain of fire as much as any of you. But when you think about it, the thought of completely missing what you were made for is a cause for unending and unlimited despair. That's why it says over the gates of hell, abandon hope, all ye who enter in. Abandon hope, to be without hope, utterly. That is a perfect sanction. Although I read somewhere that most of the people who wind up in hell are the people who didn't think it existed. A lot of truth in that. Another perfect sanction is the fact that if we commit vice, we lose our virtue. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but there is a peace and tranquility and happiness that comes from knowing that you're doing the right thing. There is misery to be had by knowing that you're living a dissolute life. That's why we note the distinction between pleasure and joy. Immoral acts may give pleasure, but they don't give joy. Joy comes with a peace of mind of knowing that the pleasure that you have is legitimate, it's warranted, it is right, it is pleasing in the sight of God. Very different matter than just raw pleasure. Any animal can have pleasure, but only a human being can have joy. Imperfect. Well, as we mentioned before with the AIDS and the STD, imperfect sanctions, sexual promiscuity, leads to things like disease, the loss of self-control. It may lead to the temptation to abortion, or therefore to abortion itself. Goethe makes a wonderful observation. He says, God forgives, man can forgive, Mother Nature never forgives. Horrible, horrible, legitimate insight. God certainly does forgive if we ask him to. Another human being, man, may forgive, but when we violate the natural law, the natural sanctions that may be accompanied to it may be utterly unavoidable. Someone who has lived as an alcoholic may reform, but still have cirrhosis of the liver, may still die in a short period of time because of the effects of his life. I think nothing is more tragic, or at least it certainly caught my attention. Some young girl who wanted to commit suicide and took an overdose of Tylenol. And of course, after she did it, she realized she shouldn't have done it, but it was just too late. It's just too late. The effect is there. She doesn't want it. She no longer wants it. She no longer wanted it to be, but the effect was there. She had literally killed herself, and it was just a matter of a short length of time before she died. You know, we're talking days or hours. Perfect sanction must occur in a future life. I got to be careful, there's a little inconsistency here. Notice under perfect sanction it says the individual loses his virtue. That's in this life. So this is not, what we're talking about perfect sanction here, this is talking about attaining one's last end. But there are a few factors that make clear why we can't do this, why we can't expect the perfect sanction in this life. First of all, God cannot be indifferent to his own law. That's asking a bit much. In other words, God makes a law and you say, please God, in my case, just, forget the rules, okay? That's not the same thing as begging forgiveness. God cannot fail to attain his intended ends. In other words, when he creates us with a spiritual and immortal soul that is destined as to its last end in a life beyond this mortal life. So when God creates us that way, he cannot fail to attain the intended ends. The intended end is concretely realized in our nature, which has an end beyond this life. The glory manifested in the reward of the just and the punishment of the unjust is something that God is going to manifest by his intention. Hate to remind us of this, but remember, God's intentions ultimately terminate in himself, not in us. That's okay. It's like being an egotist. If you're God, it's okay. The reason egotism is bad is because we're not God. So, two, God, in creating us, is manifesting his own goodness and his own glory. We will attain the ends he gives to us one way or the other. Either eternal happiness with him because we lived a virtuous life, or eternal misery by reason of the divine sanction of punishment, which must attend the violation of God's intention is in making us. And thirdly, the perfect sanction is not attained in this life, obviously, because many times evil people get away with murder in this life, and good people suffer unendingly in this life. So if there is to be a balance of justice for everybody, it's not going to be necessarily attained in this life, because, St. Augustine says good and evil fall equally upon the good and evil. You can't determine who's good or evil by how good their life seems to go. So clearly, if there's going to be an ultimate reward, it is not always in this life. And you might say, but what about people who have totally miserable lives and they wind up in a gas chamber at the end? I mean, it can happen. And that's why, thank God, that there is an afterlife wherein this person can be amply rewarded for having put up with the miseries of this life if he did so in a virtuous way. So, how do we get to that last end? As you already know, he who fails to follow the means to an end will fail to attain the end. The means to the end is the natural law. And the end is the transcendent sanction of happiness in the world to come. If we follow natural law, we will attain it. If we fail to follow natural law, we will miss that end and therefore get the natural sanction of eternal misery. All right, that takes us to the top of page 17, and I think we've terminated for the evening. Thank you.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com